The morning mist clung to the park bench like a shroud, and Sarah pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders as she watched the old man approach. Every day for the past 3 months he had walked this same path at precisely 7:15, his silver-headed cane tapping a steady rhythm against the cracked pavement. His expensive wool overcoat and polished leather shoes spoke of a world she had once known but could no longer touch, a world that had cast her out with cruel efficiency. At 30, Sarah possessed the kind of beauty that poverty couldn't quite erase, though it had certainly tried. Her auburn hair, unwashed for days, still caught the early light with copper fire. Her green eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion and loss, held depths that spoke of intelligence and resilience. The designer dress she wore, now stained and torn, was a ghost from her former life, when she had graced boardrooms and charity galas as the wife of a prominent businessman. The old man stumbled, his cane catching on an uneven stone, and Sarah was on her feet before conscious thought could stop her. "Are you all right?" she asked, steadying his elbow with gentle fingers that trembled for more than just the morning cold. He looked up at her with eyes the color of storm clouds, surprised by the kindness in her voice. Most people hurried past him now, afraid that age might be contagious, that his frailty might somehow diminish their own carefully constructed illusions of invincibility. But this woman, this beautiful, broken woman who clearly had nothing left to give, offered him her arm with the grace of a queen. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice carrying the refined cadence of old money and older manners. "I'm afraid my legs aren't quite what they used to be." Sarah smiled, and for a moment the years of hardship fell away from her face like autumn leaves. "None of us are what we used to be," she replied softly. "But that doesn't mean we can't help each other along the way." The old man, who would later tell her his name was Henry Blackwell, studied her face with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people, discerning truth from deception, sincerity from manipulation. What he saw in Sarah's eyes made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, surprising himself with the request. "These paths can be treacherous, and I find myself in need of a steady companion." Sarah glanced back at the bench where she had spent the night, where all her worldly possessions fit into a single backpack that had seen better decades. She had nowhere else to be, no urgent appointments in a life that had been stripped of all urgency except the daily struggle for survival. "I'd be honored," she said, and meant it. They walked in companionable silence through the park's winding paths, past the fountain where pigeons gathered to beg for crumbs, past the playground where children would soon arrive to fill the air with laughter and possibility. Henry moved slowly but with determination, and Sarah matched her pace to his, never making him feel rushed or burdensome. "You don't belong here," Henry said finally, his words carrying no judgment, only observation. Sarah's steps faltered for just a moment. "I'm not sure I belong anywhere anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We all belong somewhere," Henry replied with quiet conviction. "Sometimes it just takes time to find our way home." As they completed their circuit of the park, Henry paused near the bench where Sarah had been sitting. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a crisp $50 bill, holding it out to her with steady fingers. "For your kindness," he said simply. Sarah stared at the money, her pride warring with her hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, had been surviving on the kindness of soup kitchens and the occasional sandwich from well-meaning strangers, but taking money felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she could uncross. "I didn't help you for money," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Henry's smile was gentle, understanding. "I know that, my dear. That's precisely why you deserve it." After a long moment, Sarah accepted the bill with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "You have no idea what this means." "Perhaps you could join me again tomorrow?" Henry asked, his tone carefully casual. "I find that good company makes these old bones feel considerably younger." The next morning, Sarah was waiting by the bench before 7 o'clock, having spent the previous evening in the warm sanctuary of a diner, nursing a cup of coffee and a bowl of soup that had tasted like salvation. She had used Henry's money carefully: a meal, a shower at the YMCA, a small bottle of shampoo that made her feel almost human again. Henry arrived precisely on time, his face lighting up when he saw her. "You came," he said, and Sarah heard something like relief in his voice. "You were worried I wouldn't?" she asked as they began their walk. "In my experience, kindness is often a fleeting thing," Henry replied. "People do good deeds to make themselves feel better, but they rarely commit to consistency." "And what makes you think I'm different?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about this man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had received in months. Henry stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Because yesterday you steadied me when I stumbled. But more than that, you held my arm as though I were someone worth protecting. It's been a very long time since anyone has made me feel worth protecting." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Why are you alone?" she asked softly. "A man like you, with obvious means. Surely you have family, friends?" Henry's laugh was bitter, empty. "I have a fortune worth more than most small countries, my dear, but money, I've discovered, is remarkably poor company. It attracts many acquaintances, but precious few friends. And as for family—" His voice trailed off, pain flickering across his weathered features. "Well, let's just say that blood relations don't always translate to emotional bonds." They walked in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, their own losses. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I was married once," she said, her voice steady despite the pain behind the words, "to a man who promised me the world. He gave me beautiful things, a beautiful house, a beautiful life. But when the beautiful things were gone, when his business failed and the scandal broke, he decided I was no longer worth keeping around." "What kind of scandal?" Henry asked gently. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "The kind where your husband embezzles money from his clients to fund a gambling addiction in a mistress. The kind where your name gets dragged through the newspapers, where your friends disappear overnight, where you discover that the life you thought was yours was built on lies and other people's money." She paused, pulling her coat tighter against a wind that seemed to cut straight through to her bones. "He left me with nothing. Worse than nothing. He left me with debt and shame, and a name that opens no doors except the ones leading out." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his storm cloud eyes intense, with something that looked like recognition. "David Morrison," he said quietly. Sarah's face went white. "How do you—" "I was one of his victims," Henry said simply. "He stole nearly $2 million from my investment portfolio. Money I had earmarked for charitable foundations, for scholarships, for people who needed help far more than I needed another zero in my bank account." The silence between them stretched taut as a wire. Sarah felt the familiar shame wash over her, the weight of guilt by association that had crushed her spirit for so many months. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was doing." "I know you didn't," Henry said with surprising gentleness. "I've read the court transcripts, followed the case closely. You were as much a victim as any of us, perhaps more so, because you lost everything while bearing the additional burden of betrayal by someone you loved." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, months of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "I tried to give back what I could, but there was nothing left. The house, the cars, the jewelry, it all belonged to creditors. I couldn't even keep my wedding ring to sell for food." Henry reached into his coat and withdrew a pristine white handkerchief, offering it to her with the same careful courtesy he might show a queen. "David Morrison stole my money," he said quietly, "but he also, inadvertently, led me to something far more valuable." "What's that?" Sarah asked, dabbing at her eyes with the soft fabric. "A reminder that goodness exists in this world, even in the darkest circumstances. A reminder that some people choose kindness even when they have every reason to choose bitterness." As days turned to weeks, their morning walks became the cornerstone of both their routines. Henry would arrive with stories of his past, his rise from poverty to wealth, his late wife Margaret, who had died 5 years earlier, his daughter who lived in London and called twice a year out of obligation rather than love. Sarah would share pieces of her own history, her childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, her volunteer work at animal shelters, the small joys she had found even in her darkest hours. Henry began bringing small gifts: a warm scarf when the weather turned colder, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a thermos of coffee that tasted like luxury. Sarah accepted these offerings with grace, understanding that giving them brought Henry as much joy as receiving them brought her comfort. "You're rebuilding my faith in humanity," Henry told her one particularly crisp morning as they sat on their bench watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I had begun to believe that people were fundamentally selfish, that kindness was merely a performance designed to gain advantage." "And now?" Sarah asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Now I think perhaps I was looking in the wrong places," Henry replied. "Perhaps true kindness exists in the spaces between wealth and poverty, in the connections we make when we have nothing left to lose and everything left to gain." Sarah turned to study his profile, this man who had become her anchor in a world that had set her adrift. "What will you do when spring comes?" she asked. "When the weather gets warmer and you don't need a walking companion to navigate icy paths?" Henry's smile was both sad and hopeful. "I suppose I'll have to find other excuses to spend time with the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The words hung between them like a bridge, dangerous to cross, but impossible to ignore. Sarah felt her heart flutter with something she had thought was dead forever: the possibility of being valued, of being seen as more than the sum of her mistakes and misfortunes. "Henry," she said softly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not just homeless, I'm broken. I may never be whole again, may never be the kind of woman who belongs in your world." "My dear Sarah," Henry replied, reaching over to take her gloved hand in his, "you are the only person in years who has seen me as more than my bank account. You are the only one who has shown me kindness without expecting anything in return. If that isn't wholeness, then I don't know what is." Their relationship deepened with the patience of people who had learned not to rush toward happiness, knowing how quickly it could be snatched away. Henry began staying longer each morning, sometimes sitting with Sarah for hours as the park came alive around them. He told her about his business empire, built from nothing through decades of careful investment and calculated risks. She told him about her dreams, both the ones that had died and the new ones that were slowly taking root in the fertile ground of their friendship. One morning in late November, as the first snow began to fall, Henry arrived carrying a large manila envelope and wearing an expression Sarah had never seen before: nervous, excited, afraid. "I have something for you," he said, his usual composure cracking slightly. "Something I hope you'll accept, though I understand if you refuse." Sarah eyed the envelope warily. "What is it?" Henry sat down beside her, the envelope balanced on his knees like a sleeping cat. "It's an offer, a proposition. A chance for both of us to stop being so damned lonely." He opened the envelope and withdrew a sheaf of papers, legal documents with letterheads from prestigious law firms. "I've had my attorneys draw up papers for a foundation," he began, his words coming faster now, as though he needed to get them all out before his courage failed. "The Sarah Morrison Foundation for Second Chances. It would provide housing, job training, and support services for women who have lost everything through no fault of their own." Sarah stared at the papers, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Henry, I can't accept this. This is millions of dollars." $50 million to be exact, Henry interrupted. "And you're not accepting it, you're earning it. I want you to run it, Sarah. I want you to be its director, its heart, its conscience. I want you to take all the pain you've endured and transform it into hope for others." Tears were flowing freely down Sarah's face now. "But I'm nobody," she whispered. "I'm homeless, I have no credentials, no business experience." "You have something far more valuable than credentials," Henry said firmly. "You have compassion born of suffering, wisdom earned through loss, and strength forged in the fire of betrayal. You know what it's like to fall from grace, and more importantly, you know what it takes to survive the fall with your dignity intact." Sarah looked at him through her tears, seeing not just the wealthy benefactor but the lonely man who had found purpose in giving her hope. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? Why this? Why now?" Henry set the papers aside and took both her hands in his. "Because in 3 months of walking with you, I've remembered what it feels like to look forward to each new day. Because you've shown me that wealth means nothing if it can't be used to lift others up. Because I love you, Sarah Morrison, and I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure the world sees you the way I see you, as someone extraordinary who deserves every good thing life has to offer." The words, "I love you," echoed in the space between them like a prayer answered after a lifetime of asking. Sarah had thought herself beyond such feelings, had believed that David's betrayal had permanently severed her ability to trust and love. But looking into Henry's eyes, she saw not just affection but reverence, not just desire but dedication. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her lips. "But Henry, I need you to understand. I may never be the kind of woman who can move in your social circles, who can be the partner you deserve." "You are exactly the partner I deserve," Henry interrupted, his voice fierce with conviction. "You are exactly the partner I need. Everything else, the society nonsense, the pretensions, the empty performances, none of that matters. What matters is this: can you imagine a future where we face whatever comes together?" Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself for the first time in months to envision a future that extended beyond mere survival. She saw herself in an office, helping women who reminded her of her current self. She saw herself learning, growing, becoming someone who could transform pain into purpose. Most importantly, she saw herself waking up each morning, knowing that someone valued her, not for what she could give them, but for who she was beneath all the loss and sorrow. "Yes," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I can imagine that future, but there's something you need to know first." Henry waited, his expression patient and encouraging. "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "Terrified of failing you, of failing the women who would depend on this foundation, of discovering that I'm not strong enough or smart enough or worthy enough to carry this responsibility." Henry's smile was gentle, understanding. "My dear, if you weren't terrified, I would be worried. Fear means you understand the magnitude of what we're undertaking, but you won't be doing it alone. I'll be beside you every step of the way." The following weeks passed in a blur of lawyers and paperwork and plans that grew more ambitious with each conversation. Henry's attorneys, a team of sharp-suited professionals who initially viewed Sarah with barely concealed skepticism, gradually came to understand that their client's seemingly impulsive decision was actually the culmination of careful observation and deep conviction. Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about nonprofit management, grant writing, and social services. Henry arranged for her to stay in a small apartment near his estate, a place that felt palatial after months of park benches, but humble enough that she didn't feel like an imposter in her own life. "You're different," Henry observed one evening as they walked through his private gardens, past fountains that caught the moonlight like captured stars. "More confident, more yourself." Sarah considered this, her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. "I think I'm remembering who I was before David, before the scandal, before I learned to see myself through the eyes of people who had already decided I was worthless." "And who were you before all that?" Henry asked softly. "Someone who believed she could make a difference," Sarah replied. "Someone who thought kindness was the most important currency in the world. Someone who would have been honored to love a man like you." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. "Sarah Morrison," he said formally, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal was not a surprise. They had been building toward this moment for weeks, their love deepening with each shared dream and planned future. But the reality of it, the weight of being chosen again, being valued again, being seen as worthy of such devotion, took Sarah's breath away. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married on a Saturday morning in December, in the same park where they had first met, with only Henry's pastor and 2 witnesses from his legal team present. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Henry had chosen for her, elegant in its restraint, beautiful in its acknowledgement that she was beginning again, rather than trying to reclaim what was lost. The ceremony was brief but profound, each word of their vows carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom and deliberately chosen love. When Henry slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, a simple band of platinum that caught the winter light like a promise, she felt the last of her old fears fall away like autumn leaves. "I promise to love you not despite your past, but because of it," Henry said, his voice steady and sure. "Because your pain has taught you compassion, your loss has taught you gratitude, and your survival has taught you strength." "I promise to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you are," Sarah replied, her own voice clear and strong. "Because your wealth is not measured in dollars, but in decency. Your power is not in what you own, but in how you lift others up. And your legacy will not be what you accumulated, but what you shared." 2 months later, as Sarah stood in the gleaming offices of the Sarah Morrison Foundation for Second Chances, watching through the windows as women arrived for their first day of job training, she reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed her life. The homeless woman who had helped an old man navigate treacherous paths had discovered that sometimes the person you're helping is actually saving you in return. Henry appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had finally figured out what success actually looked like. "How does it feel?" he asked, handing her the warm mug and slipping his arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into his embrace, watching as one of their clients, a young mother who had lost everything in a house fire, tentatively entered the computer training room. "It feels like coming home," she said softly, like everything that happened before was just preparation for this moment. "Any regrets?" Henry asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Sarah considered the question honestly. Did she regret the pain that had brought her to that park bench? Did she regret the losses that had stripped away everything she thought mattered? Did she regret the months of uncertainty and fear that had preceded this moment of clarity and purpose? "None," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not a single one. Because without all of that, I never would have been sitting on that bench when you needed steadying. I never would have learned that love isn't about what you can offer someone, but about who you become when you're with them. I never would have discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're actually worth." Henry set down his coffee cup and turned her to face him fully, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You know what I love most about you?" he asked. "What?" "You turn everything into a gift," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your pain becomes empathy for others. Your loss becomes appreciation for what remains. Your betrayal becomes deeper capacity for trust. You take the worst things that can happen to a person and somehow transform them into the best parts of who you are." Sarah stood on her toes to kiss him, this man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to lift her up rather than walk away. "We transform them," she corrected gently. "We do it together." Through the windows of the foundation offices, the city stretched out before them like an endless field of possibility. Somewhere in those streets were women who had lost hope, who had been betrayed by those they trusted, who had fallen from grace and couldn't see a way back up. Sarah thought of them as she stood in her husband's arms, surrounded by the tangible proof that second chances were not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to reach for them. "What's next?" Henry asked, following her gaze to the bustling world beyond their windows. Sarah smiled, her hand finding his with the automatic certainty of true partnership. "Next, we help someone else remember that they're worth saving," she said. "Next, we prove that kindness is contagious, that love multiplies when shared, that every person deserves a chance to discover who they become when someone believes in them." "And after that?" Henry pressed, his eyes twinkling with the mischief that had first drawn her to him. "After that," Sarah said, laughing as she pulled him toward the door where their work awaited them, "we do it all over again. Because that's what love does. It keeps choosing to begin again, to build again, to hope again, no matter how many times the world tries to convince us that broken things can't be made beautiful. As they walked together toward their first official day as partners in both marriage and mission, Sarah reflected on the magnificent irony of her situation. She had started as a homeless woman, helping an old man navigate dangerous paths, never imagining that he would turn out to be the one with the map to guide her home. She had offered him her arm when he stumbled, not knowing that he would give her the foundation to stand on when the world seemed determined to knock her down. Outside the foundation offices, the December morning was crisp and bright, full of the same possibility that had first drawn them together in a park where two lonely souls had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places. Sarah squeezed Henry's hand as they stepped into their new life together, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, one step at a time, together, transforming each stumble into an opportunity to lift each other up. The lawyers and bodyguards had arrived that first day not as harbingers of doom but as messengers of hope, carrying documents that would change not just Sarah's life, but the lives of countless women who would benefit from the love story that had begun with a simple act of kindness. Sometimes, Sarah thought as she looked up at her husband's face, the most extraordinary adventures begin with the most ordinary gestures.